It's the great immigration debate. Do we want a big Australia? And can Australia sustain its current immigration levels? New Liberal Senator Jim Molan warned in his maiden speech last week that Australia's culture and infrastructure may not be able to handle any more legal migration. And he's not the first one to say this. In a moment, Migration Council Australia CEO Carla Wilshire and MacroBusiness Leith van Onselen will join me on this very big issue. But first, this is how the debate resurfaced this week.
I am concerned that the level of legal migration, now that we control our borders, is in excess of the capacity of our cities to absorb, both culturally or in terms of infrastructure.
We do have problems where people are concentrating in and around Sydney, in and around other capital cities.
Immigration numbers are too high, and this needs to be addressed and let the people of Australia have their say.
It's not a number that we're tied to, and it's come back considerably, and if we have to bring it back further, and that's what's in our country's best interest, that is what we'll do.
We are approaching limits on this if we have not already exceeded them. I don't have the answers, but I certainly have the concerns.
What I love more than anything about my party is that you are able to express an opinion. It doesn't actually mean the government is going to agree with your opinion.
MacroBusiness Leith van Onselen and Migration Council Australia CEO Carla Wilshire are both my guests. Welcome to National Wrap.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Patricia.
So Australia accepts basically around 190,000 permanent migrants through skilled and family immigration streams, and also, of course, 18,000 refugees. Leith, why isn't that sustainable?
Yeah, look, you just have to look at the historical average migration in Australia. So for the 116 years post-Federation, so from 1901 to now, Australia's net overseas migration averaged 73,000 per year. However, over the past 12 years, we've actually averaged about 220,000. Now, so the migration intake has effectively tripled. And there is another problem with that, in that unlike the post-war migrants, which spread out right across the country, the migrants that have arrived over the past decade or so have congregated almost primarily in Sydney and Melbourne. And this is having huge problems with respect to housing, housing affordability, infrastructure, so roads, trains, hospitals, prisons even, schools, and overall livability. So it's not about being anti-migration, it's just about paring it back a little bit to the historical norm so that the infrastructure can breathe.
Carla, what's your take on that? We are at historically high levels. Do you see as that net number every year, do you see that number as being sustainable?
Yeah, so I think we've got to break it down a bit. In terms of our, if you look at the population level and the effect of migration in terms of what it adds in percentage terms to the population, we're not at historical highs. And the other thing is that we are a migration nation. I mean, stretching back right to the post-war migration phase, our economy, the way our society has functioned has been very much built around migration. So it becomes a fundamental part of how our country is going to grow and continue to prosper.
Well, do you think it could be even higher?
Yeah, I do. I think there's probably room to go up a little bit from where we are now. I agree that migration has to be measured, it has to be sensible, it has to be in the national interest. And by and large, the way we determine our migration program is about the national interest. It's about what we need in terms of filling skill shortages, and our migration program is heavily accentuated towards skills. And it's also about growing our population in a way that adds to business confidence, adds to the economy, really kind of underpins our economic growth.
Leith, do you buy that argument that to grow the economy, because let's be clear here, many key business leaders and business groups also mount this argument that migration is essentially good for a growing economy?
Yeah, look, it certainly is. If you add more people, more inputs in people, you get more outputs in GDP, but that's not the measure that matters. It's individual living standards, it's GDP per capita, it's income per capita, it's how long you spend stuck on a train, how long you spend stuck in a car, it's whether or not you can afford a house, it's the impact on the environment. And I will say that this whole notion that Australia's got a skill shortage has been debunked over and over again. The federal government's, the Department of Education releases a skills shortages report every year, and the latest one, which was only released a few months ago, shows that Australia's skills shortage is incredibly low. And on top of that, we've got very high labour underutilisation, we've got almost no wages growth, we've got a record number of university graduates coming out of university. So where's the skill shortage? Like, why do we need to keep importing people into an oversupplied labour market? And economists the world over are concerned about automation, and that in the future there won't be enough jobs for the for the labour force. So why would you flood the nation with more labour when you're facing an oversupply? It just makes no sense.
Carla, that is an interesting question. I mean, clearly we do have infrastructure issues. Our cities, particularly those two that Leith has named, Melbourne and Sydney, are bursting, and people are feeling the squeeze. Do you attribute any of that to our high migration numbers, or our migration numbers? I won't use the word high because it's a contested word, but do you think that some of those issues are linked to those numbers?
Yeah, absolutely, Patricia. I think that's a really interesting question, and I think it raises a fundamental question about how we do the migration program. And I think where Leith and I would find very much agreement is that infrastructure is burdened by increased migration, but it's how you solve the problem, and it's where we are at this point in time. And the two major cities that often come out in this debate are Sydney and Melbourne, and congestion in Sydney and Melbourne is undoubtedly getting to a point where a significant investment in infrastructure is going to happen. In fact, one could argue that point was some years back. It's now about how we solve that problem. And one of the ways in which we're going to have to solve that problem is by decreasing the per capita cost of investment in infrastructure. And migration is part of that solution. It's part of decreasing the per capita costs. And in some senses, it's also about an acceptance that the way in which these two cities function and the way in which we live in these two cities is going to change over time. It's going to be much more about apartment living. It's going to be much more about public transport, and it's going to be much more about sort of sustainable cities of the future. I also want to pull Leith up on one of his comments, and that is that all of the credible economic research shows that migration actually adds to the per capita growth rate of the economy. The Productivity Commission has done a report on this. It's shown that it increases it by about 7% by 2060 based on the current numbers. So it does have a powerful and strong effect in terms of the per capita growth rate, but also in terms of standard of living. You know, it very much adds. It adds to real wage, after-tax real wage growth. It adds in terms of boosting labour force participation rates, and it adds in terms of training Australian workers. And this is the other point that I think we fundamentally miss in the migration program. A lot of the effects of the migration program is what is unseen. It adds dynamism and energy to our economy and to our society, and it connects us around the world, to countries all around the world, through trade linkages and investment linkages.
Leith, there is obviously a cultural dividend in terms of people coming in, but I want to ask you about one point Carla made. Don't we need to just accept that life will change in cities like Melbourne and Sydney? Perhaps we're having a lag in terms of accepting that, but essentially life is different.
Yeah, look, there's no problem with change, but it's just changed too quickly. The volume is simply too high, and it's happening too quickly. And can I pull up one point on that? The Productivity Commission's modelling on migration is not positive. The Productivity Commission has actually found that if you increase skilled migration, they did an extended report back in 2006 where they modelled a 50% increase in the skilled migrant intake, and they found that all the gains go to the migrants and wealthy owners of capital, whereas resident workers are actually made worse off and they get lower income.
I'm going to have to pull you up on that, Leith, because the more updated report, which criticises in some ways the 2006 report as being very limited in its scope,
yes, but
shows
Carla,
that the per capita increase, the amount for the general population, including people who are here as well as new migrants coming in, is 7%.
You're missing a fundamental point. That might be true with GDP per capita, but also shows that residents' wages, and I'm talking about the most recent study, actually fall under. Yes, it does. And if anyone disputes this, I'll put up the evidence on macrobusiness.com.au on Monday.
And while you're doing that, put up the evidence around our own economic modelling that was commissioned by Independent Economics and done independently, which shows that real wage growth.
Okay, I'm going to have to intervene here.
But you are a lobby group for increased migration.
All right, I'm going to intervene.
No, we are not a lobby group for increased migration.
Carla,
no, we're not.
if
No,
I
we're
can
not. Have a look at our website. We are very much about how we settle people.
Leith and Carla,
It is
I am
your
coming in.
company is stacked.
Patricia is calling us back there, Leith.
I really am. I'm really suggesting that we just park that. Leith's going to publish that. And Carla, if you could provide some of your evidence as well.
Absolutely.
And we'll look at both of those. I just want to ask a final question to both of you. This is now very much in the political sphere because we know that Peter Dutton has, and he is the Home Affairs Minister, has raised this idea of whether perhaps immigration is rising too fast. Crucial other players, including Pauline Hanson, Cory Bernardi, are also raising it. Is there, and I'll go to you first, Carla, is there a bit of a momentum to relook at these numbers and slow them down?
Yeah, look, I think that's a concern. And I think that one of the concerns are putting aside a sensible debate around our numbers, and we'd always encourage a sensible debate around the economics of migration, and also about calibrating migration to make sure it's in our best interests. And if we thought that migration was, it was in our best interest to reduce it, certainly our position as an independent think tank-based policy organisation would be to look at that. But looking at the numbers, it is very much in our best interests to look at a robust migration program. I think the really big challenge with the next year is going to be making sure that we have that debate in a very respectful way to the migrant communities that are here in Australia. And I think that's part of what we really need to focus on in the conversation.
Leith, you want to slow it down. You're hearing politicians basically make the argument that you agree with. What do you think will end up happening here? Do you think the Turnbull government is likely to slow down the rate?
Well, look, I think what we need, like we just had a plebiscite on same-sex marriage, why not let the Australian people decide? The Productivity Commission in their Migrant Intake Australia report have recommended a national plan and to give people a voice. Let's have a population plebiscite to determine the future size of Australia's population, and based on that, we'll create the policy around that. But, you know, we don't need, groups like the Migration Council, the business councils, etc., telling us that you know, big migration is in our interest. Well, how about letting us decide? We are a democracy after all, and if we can have a plebiscite on same-sex marriage, why can't we have a plebiscite on an issue like this that affects fundamentally every facet of life?
Carla, final word to you. Are you looking forward to this plebiscite?
I think what we probably need to do is look at a deliberative poll whereby we put all of the evidence in front of people and have a look at where our migration program should fit into our future story, because it's played a wonderful role to date. And the other thing I'd ask is that as we go through this process, that we're really respectful in acknowledging the contribution that migrants make. It is enormous, takes an enormous amount of courage to move to another country and to devote not only your life to making that country work and prosper, but the lives of your children and grandchildren.
I agree with that. I agree with that. Look, you know, certainly we're not about denigrating migrants, but it's about getting the balance right. So instead of Australia's population growing by 1 million people every 2.5 to 3 years, why not grow by 1 million people every 7 to 8 years? It's still growth. It's still very generous by global standards, but it'll take a lot of strain off infrastructure, housing, wages, etc. It's that simple.
Leith and Carla, I'm going to have to wrap it up. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Patricia, and good night.